What is going on, IF Warriors? It's your boy Edward V, and today we're going to talk about daily dry fasting, not prolonged dry fasting. I've done a video on prolonged dry fasting and what I think about that, and I'll link that video down in the description below if you want to check it out. But in this video, we're in the midst of Ramadan. Ramadan started on April 23rd and will end May 23rd. So can the mechanisms of dry fasting actually improve fat loss versus intermittent fasting by 3 times the amount? Well, I'm gonna go ahead and break that down in this video. Stay tuned. So this video is not going to be long, hopefully. I'm assuming that it won't be long because there are limitations to the data when it comes to dry fasting. And by limitations, I mean that there aren't any control studies of dry fasting that exist out there. So there isn't anything that will compare dry fasting with intermittent fasting and see what happens between the two. And I know you can say, well, if you look at this dry fasting study versus this intermittent fasting study, you'll see that dry fasting did well and intermittent fasting didn't do well. But unfortunately, you cannot do that. It has to be under a controlled environment. It has to be systematically the same. The methodology has to be the same. The rigors have to be the same. So that way you can get an accurate understanding of what would happen if someone decided to do intermittent fasting or if someone decided instead to do dry fasting. And the dry fasting studies that exist out there, a lot of them are observational, but some of them are prolonged dry fasting of about 5 days. One recent German study that came out in January of this year, 2020, was a 5-day dry fast, not comparing it towards normal eating or comparing it towards intermittent fasting. And with that comes the lack of ability to give you an actual answer that is backed by research. But we do have information in regards to dry fasting, so that way I can make a video based off of that information. But please take what I say with a grain of salt, because we don't have in scientific literature the comparison of both intermittent fasting and dry fasting versus each other, or even dry fasting versus just normal eating. At least with that, we can see how consistently that does versus normal eating compared to intermittent fasting versus normal eating, which is a 3 meal a day or the normal American diet. But I've seen a lot of people, even mainstream people, talk about how dry fasting enhances everything that fasting does times 3. So like 1 day of dry fasting is equivalent to 3 days of normal fasting. Well, there aren't any studies that actually back that up. There's nothing that shows that there's an elevated system with dry fasting. Now, the observations that have been done on daily dry fasting, where you dry fast for the day but then eat during that day, basically intermittent fasting but just without drinking any water, have been seen in only Ramadan studies. And it's hard to say that the positive elements that they're seeing or the positive effects are coming from dry fasting or from intermittent fasting. We do have an observational view of these Ramadan studies and see that there are positive outcomes to Ramadan fasting, but we don't know if it's because they're not drinking water or it's because they went from a normal diet and switched to an intermittent fasting diet. We just don't know. So we can't extrapolate that information and say, well, this shows that daily dry fasting is 3 times better. And don't get me wrong, I love Ramadan fasting studies because yes, they are observational. It isn't as stringent and rigorous as a control study where the methodology is created by the researcher and they have another group that's doing the opposite of what this group is doing so that we can see the differences. We know that they are fasting because they're doing it for religious purposes, and millions of people do it every year. So we know that they're following the protocol of Ramadan fasting from sunrise to sunset. We know that they're doing it. So at least we know that they're adhering to that fasting protocol. That's one of the reasons why I like the Ramadan fasting studies. But even if we were to look at it, you do have to understand that you can't control for the calorie intake. So some people can overeat or undereat, It's hard to say because we just don't know if they're eating more or eating less since it's observational. So understanding that we don't really have the studies out there for dry fasting. And if we have a study out there, it's an observational study of Ramadan fasting, which we don't know if the benefits are coming from Ramadan or from dry fasting. And any other studies are prolonged dry fasting studies with small sample sizes, and it's not compared to any other group. So it's incredibly limiting for me to answer the question of, does dry fasting burn fat 3 times faster than intermittent fasting? Now, when people say 3 times better, they're talking about overall, just the entire picture. Take what happens to you when you fast and just add 3 times to that. There are no studies that corroborate that. In terms of maybe releasing toxins 3 times faster because you're not consuming any water. So the autophagy process is more aggressive. So your cells are eating itself to recreate newer, fresher cells. Maybe that's the case, but like I said, we don't know. And one thing that you should know is that when you release toxins, that comes from things like urinating or your stool. And if you're doing a dry fast, you have less water to excrete. Therefore, you don't actually urinate or have stools because of the dry fasting process. Now, we're talking about daily dry fast. Is it harmful? No, it's not harmful to do it on a daily intermittent basis. For example, if you're fasting until you start eating, and that's when you start drinking water, and then you finish your eating window and you don't drink water again until you break your fast the next day, that's okay. There doesn't appear to be any detriments to that, and that's what happens during Ramadan. They can't eat or drink anything. But let's touch on why people think dry fasting can burn more fat or burn fat 3 times faster. The reason that they think that this can happen, or the reason that they feel that this can happen, although there have been no studies to look at this directly, is because of something called metabolic water, which is your body creating water internally simply because you have not consumed water. Your body decides, well, we will have to make water because your body is 70% water. It needs water. That's why you can go much, much longer without food than you can without water. Your body will look at things like your fat cells, use the oxygen that you're breathing in, and actually convert that into water inside of your body. Therefore, you are burning body fat because of that process. But that process takes a while before it even activates. So if you're doing daily dry fasting, it doesn't really seem like you'll be activating that process. So overall, daily dry fasting may not be bad for you, but it may also not have any inherent benefits over just simply intermittent fasting. Now, if anybody goes down in the comment section and says, well, no, yes, it does because you burn fat faster or you remove toxins better, or there are no studies to corroborate what you are saying. This is a theory based on what normally happens when you don't drink water for long periods of time. And the only thing that they have as concrete scientific evidence is that you become dehydrated when you do dry fasting for a long period of time. But like I said, it isn't too detrimental to just simply dry fast on a daily intermittent basis. Intermittent dry fasting, if you will. You probably won't gain any benefits from it, but you won't lose any benefits from it either. Hopefully this video has helped you guys and help you understand that there is a lack of research in this topic. It's kind of hard too to get a methodology like this passed. People in the medical field and researchers are very weary of putting people through a dry fasting process. But as always, I want to thank my patrons for my Patreon, and I'm going to go ahead and put their names right up here. And as always, guys, I'll see you on Wednesday for another FAQ. Peace.